The cast-iron Dutch oven hit the cobblestones with a deafening clang, and Eleanor Blackwood's last shred of dignity shattered along with it. Around her, the crowd of Philadelphia's finest citizens pressed closer, their voices rising like carrion birds circling a kill. "Thief!" someone shouted. "Fraud!" cried another. The bailiff's meaty hand closed around her arm as he announced the final seizure of her late husband's bakery equipment, payment for debts she'd never known existed until the coffin was in the ground. In that moment, standing in the autumn rain with nothing but her grandmother's Dutch oven and the clothes on her back, Eleanor understood what it meant to have absolutely nowhere left to fall. But this is just the beginning of our story. If you want to discover how a disgraced widow found redemption in the wildest corners of Colorado, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels across the world. The Philadelphia courthouse steps had never seemed so steep. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the top, her plus-size frame trembling not from the October cold but from the weight of 300 pairs of judging eyes. Below her, the crowd had gathered like wolves to a wounded deer, their faces twisted with that peculiar mixture of pity and satisfaction that good Christian folk reserve for watching their neighbors fall from grace. "The estate of Gerald Blackwood is hereby declared insolvent," the bailiff announced, his voice carrying across the square with practiced efficiency. "All assets are to be liquidated immediately to satisfy outstanding debts." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her Dutch oven, the only item she'd managed to hide before the creditors arrived. It had been her grandmother's, brought over from Germany in 1847, and it represented the sum total of her worldly possessions. Everything else, the bakery, the apartment above it, even her wedding ring, had already been claimed by men in expensive suits who'd explained with infuriating patience that her husband's gambling debts superseded any claim she might have as his widow. "Fraud!" The shout came from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. Eleanor couldn't identify the speaker, but she recognized the sentiment. In the 3 weeks since Gerald's death, she'd heard it whispered in every shop, every church, every street corner. Never mind that she'd known nothing of his secret life, his card games, his promissory notes scattered across the city like poisonous seeds. In the eyes of Philadelphia society, ignorance was no defense. A rotten apple core struck her shoulder, followed by cruel laughter. Eleanor forced herself to stand straight, to keep her chin up even as shame burned through her chest like hot coals. She'd been born Eleanor Morrison, daughter of a respected schoolteacher, granddaughter of the finest baker in the German district. She'd married Gerald Blackwood believing him to be an honest tradesman building a respectable business. She'd worked beside him for 8 years, rising at dawn to knead dough, staying late to scrub flour from every surface, never questioning where the money went or why they never seemed to prosper despite the bakery's success. What a fool she'd been. Make way. A new voice cut through the jeering, sharp with authority. The crowd parted reluctantly as Sheriff Morton pushed through, his weathered face set in grim lines. He'd known Eleanor since she was a girl, had bought bread from her grandmother's shop every Sunday. The pity in his eyes was almost worse than the crowd's contempt. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly, "you need to leave the premises. The new owners are taking possession within the hour. Where exactly am I supposed to go, Sheriff?" Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "My family is dead. My husband left me with nothing but debts and disgrace. Tell me, where does a woman in my position go?" Sheriff Morton looked away, uncomfortable. "There's the county poorhouse, no." The word emerged as a fierce whisper. Eleanor had visited the poorhouse once, delivering bread for the inmates. She'd seen the dead eyes, the broken spirits, the slow death of hope that characterized every soul trapped within those walls. She would starve in the streets before she surrendered to that fate. The sheriff sighed and reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a folded newspaper. "Then perhaps this might interest you. Page 7, bottom of the advertisements. It's a long way from Philadelphia, Mrs. Blackwood, but it's something." Eleanor took the paper with numb fingers. Her eyes found the listing he'd indicated: cook needed. Remote Colorado mining camp. Housing provided. Inquire, J. Garrett, Silver Peak Station, Colorado. She looked up, incredulous. Sheriff, I've never been west of the Susquehanna River, neither had most of the folks who built this country. He pressed something into her other hand, a small leather pouch that clinked softly. Train fare, with a bit left over. Call it payment for all those years your grandmother gave my family bread on credit when times were lean. Don't argue with me, girl. Just go. Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Thank you, she whispered, don't thank me. Just survive. Sheriff Morton tipped his hat and disappeared back into the crowd before she could say anything more. The journey west became a blur of locomotives and way stations, of sleeping sitting up in hard wooden seats and eating nothing but the stale bread she could afford from platform vendors. Eleanor watched Pennsylvania give way to Ohio, Ohio to Illinois, Illinois to the endless grasslands beyond. With each mile, Philadelphia and its judgment fell further behind, but the weight of her shame traveled with her like a persistent shadow. She sold her wedding ring in Kansas City for $17. It should have hurt more than it did, but she'd stopped feeling much of anything by then. The gold band had represented promises Gerald never intended to keep, a future that existed only in her naive imagination. Good riddance to it. By the time the train rattled into Denver 3 weeks after leaving Philadelphia, Eleanor had lost 12 pounds she couldn't afford to lose and gained a hardness around her eyes that made her look 10 years older. She spent 2 days in the city, using the last of her money to purchase practical supplies: a heavy wool coat, sturdy boots, a thick shawl. The shopkeeper's wife took one look at her and insisted on throwing in a pair of warm stockings, for free. Dear, you'll need them where you're going. The final leg of the journey required a stagecoach that climbed into mountains Eleanor had only read about in books. The air grew thin and cold, sharp as broken glass in her lungs. The other passengers, a mining engineer and 2 rough-looking prospectors, eyed her with frank curiosity that made her skin crawl. You got family in Silver Peak, ma'am? The engineer asked as they jolted over another pothole. Employment, Eleanor replied curtly, clutching her Dutch oven closer. Employment. One of the prospectors laughed. A sound like rocks grinding together. Lady, Silver Peak ain't exactly the place for refined employment. What kind of work you planning to do? Cooking. The men exchanged glances that made Eleanor's stomach twist with unease. Well, the engineer said carefully, I suppose Jackson Garrett's operation could use a woman's touch. Lord knows those children need someone. Children. This was the first Eleanor had heard of children. The advertisement had mentioned nothing beyond cooking and housing. You don't know. The prospector's grin revealed several missing teeth. Garrett's running a whole orphanage up there, practically. Kids from dead miners, mostly. 8 or 9 of them last I heard. Ranging from babes in arms to half-grown boys. Place is a disaster, from what folks say. Eleanor's heart sank. An orphanage. She'd agreed to cook for an orphanage in the middle of nowhere, for a man she'd never met, based on a 12-word advertisement. What had she been thinking? But then, what choice did she have? Philadelphia was behind her, and ahead lay only the unknown. At least an orphanage full of children sounded better than the poor house or starving in the streets. The stagecoach crested a final ridge, and Silver Peak came into view, if one could dignify the collection of ramshackle buildings with the word view. A dozen structures clung to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull. Clustered around a dark opening in the rock face that must be the mine entrance. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but the settlement had a desolate, temporary quality, as if the whole thing might blow away in the next strong wind. Here we are, the driver called down. Such as it is, the coach rolled to a stop in front of a building that announced itself as Silver Peak Station via a hand-painted sign that hung crookedly from one hinge. Eleanor climbed down on shaking legs, her breath fogging in the thin mountain air. November had arrived while she traveled, and up here at what must be nearly 10,000 feet, winter had already established its dominion. Snow dusted the rocky ground, and the wind cut through her new coat as if it were made of paper. "Mrs. Blackwood?" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough as gravel. Eleanor turned and found herself facing a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself. Jackson Garrett stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled old leather. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pale against his tanned skin. His eyes were gray as winter sky, and they regarded her with absolutely no warmth. "Mr. Garrett, I presume." Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, refused to be intimidated despite the fact that this man looked like he could snap her in half without effort. "You came." He said it like an accusation, as if her arrival was somehow an inconvenience. "Didn't expect you to actually show up. Most folks read remote Colorado mining camp and have the sense to stay home. I don't have a home, Mr. Garrett." Eleanor kept her voice level. "That's why I'm here." Something flickered in those cold eyes, recognition, perhaps, or maybe just evaluation. "Fair enough. You know anything about cooking for a dozen people with limited supplies and primitive conditions? I ran a bakery in Philadelphia for 8 years, ran it into the ground, from what I hear." His words hit like physical blows. "Sheriff Morton sent word ahead. Said you were desperate. Destitute, and had nowhere else to go." "That true?" Eleanor's face burned despite the cold. Of course word had traveled ahead. Of course this stranger knew her shame. "Yes," she said quietly. "All of that is true. Good." Garrett picked up the small trunk she'd shipped ahead, her only luggage besides the Dutch oven. "Desperate folks work harder. Follow me." He strode off without waiting to see if she'd comply, his long legs eating up the snowy ground. Eleanor hurried after him, struggling to keep pace. They passed several of the ramshackle buildings, a general store, a saloon, what looked like a crude assayer's office. Miners watched from doorways and windows, their faces ranging from curious to hostile. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her chin up, even as she heard the whispers start. "That's Garrett's new cook, mighty fine-looking woman for these parts. Wonder how long before she runs screaming back to civilization." Garrett led her past the last of the buildings to a larger structure set apart from the rest. It had clearly been built as a bunkhouse for miners, but someone had attempted to make it more homelike with shutters on the windows and a small covered porch. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Eleanor could hear children's voices from inside, shrill, chaotic, the sound of young lives completely out of control. "This is where you'll be working." Garrett stopped at the door, his hand on the latch. 8 children, ages 4 to 14. Their fathers died in the mine over the past 2 years. Some still have mothers down in Denver or back east, trying to make enough money to send for them. Some don't. I keep them here because I don't have the heart to send them to an asylum, and because every time I look at them I remember that I was underground making money when I should have been with my own wife before she died. It was the longest speech he'd made since meeting her, and the raw pain beneath the words made Eleanor's breath catch. This angry, intimidating man carried his own burden of grief and guilt. "What happened to your wife?" she asked gently. "Childbirth fever, 2 years ago. Clara was 31 years old, healthy as a horse one day and dead 3 days later. Left me with a newborn daughter I didn't know how to care for and guilt that'll probably kill me before my time." He yanked open the door. "Welcome to hell, Mrs. Blackwood." The interior of the bunkhouse assaulted Eleanor's senses immediately. The smell hit her first, unwashed bodies, soiled diapers, the acrid stench of a chamber pot that needed emptying. The space was one large room with bunks lining the walls, a crude kitchen area at one end, and a potbelly stove in the center that fought a losing battle against the cold seeping through the walls. Clothing lay scattered across every surface. Broken toys and abandoned dishes created an obstacle course across the floor, and the children, God, the children. Eleanor counted 8 of them, just as Garrett had said. A baby wailed in a makeshift cradle. 2 small boys fought over a wooden horse near the stove. A girl of perhaps 6 sat alone in a corner, rocking back and forth with dead eyes. 3 older children, 2 boys and a girl, had established themselves in various corners of the room, their faces showing the hard edges of those forced to grow up too fast. The oldest, a girl of about 14 with stringy brown hair and a malnourished frame, stood at the stove attempting to stir something in a pot that smelled like burned onions and despair. She looked up when the door opened, and Eleanor saw fear flash across her face. "Pa," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm trying, I swear I'm trying, but, it's all right, Sarah." Garrett's voice lost some of its harshness. "This is Mrs. Blackwood. She's going to help you. Going to help all of you." 8 pairs of eyes turned to Eleanor. In their gazes she saw suspicion, hope, resentment, need, the entire spectrum of human emotion concentrated in those young faces. The girl in the corner, tiny, maybe 4 years old, with matted blonde hair, whispered something that sounded like "Mama." Eleanor's heart, which she'd thought thoroughly hardened by recent events, cracked clean open. These children had been abandoned by fate and left to struggle under the care of a grieving man who clearly had no idea how to raise them. They lived in squalor not because they were unloved but because they were overwhelmed. She set down her Dutch oven with careful precision and began removing her coat. "All right then," she said briskly, addressing the children. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood, but you may call me Miss Ellie. I'm going to be cooking for you from now on, which means we're going to need to establish some order around here. But first," she turned to Sarah. "What's burning in that pot?" "It was supposed to be stew," Sarah whispered, tears starting to well. "But I forgot about it, Anne." "No tears. We'll fix it." Eleanor moved to the stove, assessed the situation with practiced eyes, and made a decision. "This is beyond saving, but we can start fresh. Who here can draw water from the well?" The 2 older boys raised their hands tentatively. "Excellent. I need 2 buckets, 1 for cooking, 1 for washing. Now, please." She turned to the remaining older girl. "What's your name, dear?" "Margaret." Meg, I need you to gather every plate, cup, and utensil in this building and bring them here to the kitchen." "Can you do that?" Meg nodded, something like relief crossing her face at having a clear task. Eleanor surveyed the kitchen supplies with a sinking heart. There was almost nothing to work with: a few dented pots, mismatched utensils, a bag of flour that felt suspiciously light, some potatoes going soft in a basket. But she'd made something from nothing before, and she could do it again. Behind her, Garrett cleared his throat. "I sleep in the mine office," he said gruffly. "Couldn't stand being in here anymore after Clara died. It's warmer, quieter. You can have the small room off the kitchen, used to be storage. There's a cot in there, nothing fancy, that's fine. I'll pay you $5 a week plus room and board. That's fair wages for these parts, that's more than fair." Eleanor didn't look at him, kept her attention on the meager supplies. "When do the children eat?" "When they remember to feed themselves, mostly. Sarah tries, but she's just a child herself." Eleanor did turn then, caught the flash of guilt and helplessness in Garrett's face before he masked it with gruffness again. "Then we'll start with a proper supper schedule. 6 o'clock every evening. I'll need you to authorize credit at the general store. I'm going to need more supplies than what's here, whatever you need." He pulled on his hat, clearly eager to escape. "I'll check in tomorrow," and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with an air of relief that would have been comical if it wasn't so sad. The man had built himself a fortress of grief and guilt. Walling himself away from these children who needed him, punishing himself by sleeping in a cold office rather than accepting the comfort of a home. Well, Eleanor had her own grief and her own guilt. Perhaps that made her uniquely qualified for this position. She rolled up her sleeves and turned to face the 8 children staring at her. The baby had stopped crying, and even the 2 boys fighting over the wooden horse had fallen silent. They watched her with the wary eyes of animals who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "All right, my dears," Eleanor said, making her voice warm despite her exhaustion. "Let's begin by establishing one rule. In this house, we take care of each other. That means everyone helps, everyone works, and everyone eats. No exceptions." "Agreed." Silence. Then, slowly, Sarah nodded. "Agreed, good." Now then, Eleanor reached for her precious Dutch oven, the last remnant of her old life, the tool that had saved her grandmother's family during the hard years. "Let me tell you about the magic of good bread, and how it has the power to turn any house into a home." As she began to work, measuring flour by feel, coaxing heat from the reluctant stove, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Philadelphia and its judgment seemed very far away now. Here, in this cold bunkhouse full of orphaned children in overwhelming need, she had found something she thought she'd lost forever. She had found a purpose. The bread rose in the warmth of the Dutch oven through that first long night, and with it rose something Eleanor had thought dead: hope. She worked by lamplight while the children slept in their bunks, scrubbing surfaces that hadn't seen soap in months, organizing the chaos into something resembling order. Her back ached and her hands grew raw, but the physical labor felt like absolution, each stroke of the brush washing away a bit of Philadelphia's shame. By dawn, the bunkhouse smelled of fresh bread instead of despair. Eleanor pulled the loaves from the oven just as the children began to stir, their small faces appearing over the edges of bunks like prairie dogs emerging from burrows. The littlest one, the blonde girl who'd whispered, "Mama," climbed down from her bed and padded across the floor in bare feet despite the cold. "Hungry," she said, her voice small and uncertain. Eleanor's heart clenched. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The child's lower lip trembled. "Violet." "Well, Miss Violet, you're just in time for breakfast." Eleanor broke off a piece of warm bread, slathered it with butter she'd found in the cold box, and handed it to the little girl. Violet took it with both hands, her eyes going wide as she bit into the soft interior. A sound emerged from her throat, half sob, half sigh, and tears began rolling down her cheeks. "What's wrong? Is it too hot?" Eleanor knelt beside her. Alarmed, "It tastes like Mama," Violet whispered. Before she went away, Eleanor pulled the child into her arms, felt the thin body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for such a small frame. Around them, the other children had gathered, drawn by the smell of bread and the sound of crying. They stood in a ragged semicircle, their faces showing the complex mathematics of grief, calculating how much love they could risk, how much hope they dared invest in this new woman who might disappear like all the others. "Your mama didn't want to go away," Eleanor said softly, stroking Violet's matted hair. "I promise you that. Mamas never want to leave their babies. But sometimes life is cruel and takes them anyway." She looked up at the other children. "Come here, all of you. There's enough bread for everyone, and we're going to sit down together like a proper family and eat breakfast." They came slowly, suspiciously, but they came. Sarah helped wrangle the baby, a boy named Thomas, Eleanor learned, while the two fighting brothers, Henry and James, showed they could cooperate when properly motivated. Meg set plates on the crude table with the precision of someone desperate for structure. The oldest boys, 14-year-old Robert and 12-year-old Luke, hung back until Eleanor fixed them with a look that brooked no argument. "Sit," she said firmly. Now, Saturday, Eleanor portioned out the bread, making sure each child received an equal share. It wasn't much, just bread and butter, weak tea sweetened with a bit of precious sugar, but it was warm and it was offered with care, and that made all the difference. The children ate in silence at first, then gradually began to talk, tentative voices gaining confidence as bellies filled and warmth spread through the room. "Miss Ellie?" Sarah's voice was hesitant. "Pa said you came from Philadelphia. That's a real city, isn't it? With buildings and everything?" "It is indeed. Buildings so tall they block out the sky, streets paved with cobblestones, shops full of things you've never imagined." Eleanor poured more tea. But cities can be cold places. Colder than any mountain winter. People walk right past each other without seeing, without caring. I'll take this rough little camp over Philadelphia any day. Why'd you leave then? Robert asked, his tone challenging. At 14, he was old enough to recognize evasion, old enough to test boundaries. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Because my husband died and left me with nothing but debts and disgrace. Because Philadelphia decided I was responsible for his failures and made my life unbearable. Because I had nowhere else to go. She paused, let the truth settle over the table. I came here the same way all of you arrived, desperate, alone, and hoping against hope that someone might give me a chance to prove I'm worth more than my worst day. Silence fell, but it was a different quality of silence now. Understanding had entered the room, the recognition that this woman knew something of their pain. Well, Robert said finally, his voice losing its edge, that's the best bread I've had in 2 years, so I reckon you're proving it already. The compliment was gruff, almost reluctant, but it was offered genuinely. Eleanor accepted it with a nod, blinking back unexpected tears. These children had every reason to be hard and suspicious, yet they were willing to extend trust to her. She would not betray that trust. She would not fail them the way Philadelphia had failed her. The door banged open without warning, and Jackson Garrett filled the frame like an avenging angel. His face set in harsh lines. He stopped abruptly, taking in the scene, the clean floor, the orderly table, the children sitting together eating bread, Violet perched on Eleanor's lap like she belonged there. What's all this? His voice was rough with something Eleanor couldn't identify. Surprise? Suspicion? Hope? This is breakfast, Mr. Garrett. We eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and noon when possible. Eleanor kept her tone matter-of-fact. Would you like some bread? He stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor stared back, refusing to be intimidated. Finally, almost against his will, Garrett stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He moved to the table with the careful steps of a man entering unfamiliar territory. Accepted the plate Eleanor handed him, and sat down on the bench next to Robert. The children watched their father with wary eyes. He watched them back, and the grief in his face was so raw that Eleanor had to look away. This man loved these children desperately, she realized. He simply didn't know how to show it anymore, didn't know how to be in this house where his wife had died, didn't know how to reconcile his guilt with his duty. It's good bread, Garrett said finally, his voice gruff, my grandmother's recipe. She used to say that bread baked with care feeds more than the body, it feeds the soul. Eleanor rose to refill the teapot, giving Garrett space to simply exist with his children. I'll need to make a list of supplies from the general store today. We're critically short of basics, make your list. I'll send Robert down with my authorization. Garrett stood abruptly, as if the domesticity was too much to bear. But then he did something that surprised Eleanor. He rested his hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder, squeezed gently, and his voice softened. You did well, daughter. Holding things together until help came. I'm proud of you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Really, Pa, really? He nodded to Eleanor. Mrs. Blackwood. And then he was gone again, fleeing to his office where grief and guilt couldn't ambush him over breakfast. The days that followed established a rhythm that transformed the bunkhouse from chaos to something resembling order. Eleanor woke before dawn to stoke the fire and begin the day's bread. She taught Sarah how to make simple soups, showed Meg the proper way to wash clothing so it actually came clean, enlisted Henry and James in wood-chopping duty that channeled their energy productively. Robert and Luke she sent to the general store multiple times, trusting them with errands that made them feel useful and valued, and Violet, sweet, traumatized Violet, became Eleanor's shadow, following her everywhere with those heartbreaking blue eyes. The child spoke rarely, but her presence was constant, a small hand tucking into Eleanor's skirt whenever they moved through the bunkhouse. She's taken to you fierce. Sarah observed one afternoon while they folded laundry together. Hasn't spoken this much since her mama died last spring. Mostly she just rocks in that corner and hums. Eleanor glanced at Violet, who sat nearby playing with a rag doll someone had sewn from scraps. What happened to her mother? Fever took her. Same as took Pa's wife Clara. Violet was there when it happened, watched her mama slip away over 3 days. She was only 3 years old. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes at night she screams in her sleep, calling for her mama. Nothing any of us could do would calm her, and now, she sleeps through the night. Ever since you came. Sarah looked at Eleanor with something like wonder. How'd you do that? Eleanor didn't have an answer. She only knew that when Violet woke screaming that first night, she'd gone to the child without thinking, lifted her from the bunk, and carried her to the rocking chair by the stove. She'd held Violet and hummed an old German lullaby her grandmother had sung, rocking until the small body relaxed and sleep returned. She'd done the same thing every night since, and gradually the nightmares had diminished. I didn't do anything special, Eleanor said finally. I just showed up when she needed someone, but it was more than that, and she knew it. These children had taught her something Philadelphia never could, that worth wasn't measured in possessions or reputation. Wasn't dependent on what society thought of you. Worth was measured in showing up, day after day, doing the work that needed doing even when it was hard and thankless and lonely. The transformation of the bunkhouse didn't go unnoticed. Miners began stopping by in the evenings, drawn by the smell of fresh bread and the sound of children's laughter that hadn't been heard in months. Eleanor fed them when she could, stretched the supplies to accommodate rough men who looked at her cooking the way desert travelers looked at water. Ma'am, one of them said, hat in hand, that's the first decent meal I've had since my wife passed. Thank you, word spread. Within 2 weeks, Eleanor had established what amounted to a small restaurant operation. Feeding not just the children but a rotating cast of lonely miners who paid what they could, a few coins, a sack of potatoes, a rabbit they trapped. The money went into a tin on the shelf, and Eleanor used it to buy better supplies, to gradually improve the quality of life in the bunkhouse. Jackson Garrett watched all of this from a distance, appearing at mealtimes with increasing regularity but never staying long, never quite integrating himself back into the life of the house. Eleanor caught him sometimes standing in the doorway, just watching Sarah laugh over a shared joke, watching Henry and James play peacefully instead of fighting, watching Violet follow Eleanor around like a devoted puppy. The grief in his eyes during those moments was almost unbearable to witness. It was 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival when she finally confronted him about it. She'd gone to the mine office to deliver his supper, he'd missed the evening meal again, and found him sitting at his desk staring at a daguerreotype in a small wooden frame. Even from the doorway, Eleanor could see it showed a woman holding a baby, her face bright with joy. That's Clara, Garrett said without looking up. And Violet, 3 days old. This was taken 2 days before the fever started. Eleanor set the plate of food on the desk and pulled up a stool, uninvited. Tell me about her, why? His voice was defensive. But underneath was a desperate need to talk, to remember, to grieve properly, because she was the mother of that little girl who follows me around like a lost lamb. Because your children deserve to remember her as more than the woman who died. Because grief that stays locked inside turns poisonous, Mr. Garrett, and you're drowning in it. He was silent for so long Eleanor thought he might order her out. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Clara had been the daughter of a Denver merchant, educated and refined, completely unsuited for life in a rough mining camp. But she'd loved Jackson with a fierce determination that overcame every obstacle, followed him into the mountains, learned to make a home in impossible conditions. She'd been strong and funny and completely devoted to their growing family, for Violet wasn't their first child. There had been 2 others before her, both lost to illness before they reached their 2nd year. When Clara got pregnant again, the doctor told us it was dangerous, Garrett said, his voice raw. Said she'd already lost too much, that another birth might kill her. But Clara wanted that baby more than she wanted safety. Said every child was a gift, even if they only had them for a little while. He touched the daguerreotype gently. Violet was born healthy, and for 3 days I thought we'd finally caught a break. Then the fever came. You were working in the mine when she died. I was a mile underground chasing a new vein, thinking about how the extra money would let us build a bigger house, maybe send the children to proper schools someday. Meanwhile my wife was dying and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. His hands clenched into fists. I came up to find Sarah screaming for help, Clara already gone, and Violet crying in a cradle next to her mother's body. What kind of man lets that happen? Eleanor reached across the desk and took his hand, held it firmly when he tried to pull away. The kind of man who was trying to provide for his family. The kind of man who carries guilt that isn't his to carry. Mr. Garrett, Jackson, you didn't kill your wife. Fever killed her, and bad luck, and the harshness of this life we live. But you're killing yourself now with this exile you've imposed, sleeping in this cold office instead of with your daughter, avoiding meals with your children because you can't bear to see the empty chair. I can't, he said, and his voice broke. I can't sit at that table and pretend everything's fine when she should be there. I can't sleep in that house where she died. I can't, you can. You must. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Because your children need you, and because Clara would be heartbroken to see you like this. Do you think she'd want you to punish yourself forever? To deny Violet a father because you couldn't save her mother? Jackson pulled his hand away and stood abruptly, pacing the small office like a caged animal. You don't understand. You didn't lose someone you loved, didn't I? Eleanor's voice turned sharp. My husband left me with nothing but shame and debt. He destroyed our life together with his lies and his gambling, and then he had the audacity to die and leave me to face the consequences alone. I stood in a public square and listened to hundreds of people call me a fraud and a thief. I sold my wedding ring to buy train fare west because I literally had nowhere else to go. Don't tell me I don't understand loss, Mr. Garrett. I understand it just fine. They stared at each other across the office. Two damaged people recognizing the fractures in each other's armor. Then, slowly, Jackson sank back into his chair. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That was unfair of me, it was. But I forgive you, because I understand that grief makes us say things we don't mean. Eleanor stood, brushed flour from her apron. Your supper's getting cold. Eat it, then come to the bunkhouse tomorrow morning for breakfast. Your children miss you, and Violet needs to see her father's face across the table, not just his back as he's leaving. I don't know if I can. You can. One meal at a time, one day at a time. That's how we survive, Jackson. That's how we heal. She moved toward the door, then paused. And perhaps you might consider building Violet a proper cradle. That basket she's sleeping in now is falling apart, and winter's coming hard. A father's hands making something for his daughter, that would mean something. She left before he could respond, walking back through the cold November night to the bunkhouse where lamplight spilled from the windows and children's voices created a symphony of normal life. Eleanor had learned something in the weeks since arriving in Silver Peak. Home wasn't a place, and family wasn't always blood. Sometimes home was what you built from scraps and determination. Sometimes family was what you chose to create from the broken pieces of your own heart. 3 days later, Eleanor woke to the sound of sawing. She rose in the pre-dawn darkness and went to investigate, finding Jackson Garrett in the corner of the bunkhouse working by lamplight. Scattered around him were pieces of pine wood, carefully measured and cut. As Eleanor watched, he fit 2 pieces together with the precision of someone who knew his way around carpentry. Couldn't sleep, he said without looking up. Figured I might as well make myself useful. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and moved closer, saw that he was building a cradle, not a crude basket like Violet currently used, but a proper cradle with curved rockers and carefully smoothed edges. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's what she deserves. What they all deserve. His hands stilled on the wood, and when he looked up at Eleanor, his eyes were raw with emotion. "You were right. About all of it. I've been so busy grieving that I forgot I still have a daughter who needs me, children who need me. Clara would be ashamed of the man I've become, no." Eleanor knelt beside him. "Clara would understand. Grief isn't something you just push through, Jackson. It's something you carry, something you learn to live with. But you can't let it consume you completely, or you disappear along with the person you lost." He nodded slowly, ran his hand over the cradle's smooth wood. "Will you help me? I don't know how to do this anymore, how to be a father. How to live in a house full of children, how to move forward when part of me died with Clara. I'll help you," Eleanor promised. "We'll help each other." Over the following weeks, Jackson began the slow, painful process of rejoining his family. He came to breakfast every morning, sitting at the head of the table with Violet on his lap, her small hands wrapped around his thick fingers. He moved back into the house, taking the small room that had been Clara's sewing space, close enough to hear if Violet cried in the night. He worked on small projects in the evenings, fixing the loose shutter on the window, building a proper shelf for Eleanor's Dutch oven, carving simple toys for the younger children. And he watched Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch, though she pretended not to notice. She noticed when he appeared one morning carrying bolts of heavy wool fabric, his face carefully neutral. "Thought you might need these," he said gruffly. "Winter's coming hard, and your coat looks thin." The fabric was deep green, expensive and beautiful, clearly selected with care. Eleanor ran her fingers over the soft wool, recognized it for what it was, not a practical gift, but a personal one. Jackson had noticed her shivering, had paid attention to what she needed, had spent money they could ill afford on fabric sized generously enough for her fuller figure. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "This is far too generous. You've made this place a home again. You've given my children their laughter back. You've reminded me I'm still alive." His gray eyes met hers, and in their depths Eleanor saw something that made her pulse quicken. "It's not generous enough, Mrs. Blackwood." "Not nearly enough." He left before she could respond, but Eleanor stood holding the green wool for long minutes afterward, her heart pounding with a feeling she'd thought dead and buried in Philadelphia. This wasn't the desperate passion of youth or the comfortable partnership of her marriage to Gerald. This was something entirely new, a slow-burning awareness, a gradual recognition that Jackson Garrett saw her not as a housekeeper or a convenience, but as a woman. A desirable woman. A woman worthy of attention and care. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor sat by the stove working on transforming the green wool into a proper winter coat. Her needle moved with practiced precision, each stitch a meditation. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Jackson enter until he spoke from the doorway. "You shouldn't be up so late. You work too hard as it is." Eleanor looked up, found him watching her with that intense gaze that made her skin warm despite the cold. "Someone has to make sure this household runs properly, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. "May I sit with you?" She nodded, unable to speak. He pulled up a stool beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the combination of sawdust and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of her needle through fabric. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jackson began finally. "About learning to live with grief instead of being consumed by it. About how Clara would want me to move forward." He paused, seemed to gather courage. "I think she'd be glad I found you. I think she'd approve of the woman who's teaching Violet to smile again, who's making sure Sarah remembers she's still a child, who's turning this broken house back into a home." Eleanor's hands stilled on her sewing. "Jackson, I'm not saying this right." He rubbed his face, frustrated with himself. "I'm not good with words, never have been. But I need you to know that you're not just the hired help to me. You're not just convenient. He struggled, searching for the right words. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I sleep. You're the reason I can walk into that house without feeling like I'm drowning. Stop. Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. She set down her sewing and turned to face him fully. Jackson, I care for you too. I care for your children and this life we're building together. But we need to be careful here. People in this town are already watching, already whispering about the widow and the widower living under one roof. If we move too fast, if we give them ammunition, they could make trouble that could hurt the children, I know. His jaw clenched. Already heard the talk. Hiram Colfax stopped by the mine office last week, made some comments about improper arrangements and moral oversight. Said his wife Constance has been writing letters to the territorial authorities about the situation here. Eleanor's blood ran cold. What kind of letters? The kind that could get the children taken away. The kind that question whether a man in my situation has the moral fitness to raise orphans. His hands clenched into fists. They're using your presence here, as proof of my unsuitability, then I should leave. Eleanor stood abruptly, even though the thought of leaving felt like tearing out her own heart. I won't be the reason those children lose the only home they have. Jackson stood too, caught her hand before she could move away. No. Running away won't solve this. It'll just prove to people like Colfax that there was something wrong with our arrangement. His grip tightened. There's only one solution that protects everyone. Eleanor's breath caught as understanding dawned. Jackson, no. You can't marry me. The words came out rough, urgent. Nothing like a proper proposal. Not because of gossip or convenience, but because I need you. Because you've become essential to my life and to my children's lives. Because when I imagine tomorrow without you in it, everything goes dark again. He raised her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Marry me, Eleanor Blackwood. Help me raise these children properly. Be my partner in building something good from all this grief and loss. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't how she'd imagined a proposal, standing in a rough bunkhouse in the middle of the night, motivated partly by necessity and partly by feelings neither of them had fully processed. It wasn't romantic or elegant. It was messy and complicated and terrifying. It was also the most honest thing anyone had ever offered her. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Jackson pulled her into his arms then, held her with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. Eleanor buried her face in his shoulder and felt something shift in her chest, not the falling in love of storybooks, but something deeper and more permanent. A recognition that two broken people could create something whole together. That family wasn't always born from passion, but sometimes from shared purpose and mutual respect and the courage to show up day after day. Outside, the November wind howled through the mountains, but inside the bunkhouse. Wrapped in Jackson's arms with his heart beating steadily beneath her ear, Eleanor finally understood what it meant to come home. They told the children the next morning at breakfast, and the response was more complicated than Eleanor had anticipated. Sarah burst into tears, happy ones, she insisted through her sobs, and immediately began planning what everyone would wear. Henry and James whooped with joy and nearly knocked over the table in their enthusiasm. Robert and Luke exchanged cautious glances but nodded their approval. Baby Thomas gurgled obliviously in his high chair, and Meg smiled for what might have been the first time since Eleanor arrived, but Violet went completely still. Her blue eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at Eleanor. Then, without warning, she scrambled down from her chair and ran to her bunk, burrowing under the blankets until she disappeared completely. Violet, sweetheart. Eleanor started to follow, but Jackson caught her arm. Let me, he said quietly. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bunk, his large hands gentle as he pulled back the blanket. Little bird, what's wrong? I thought you'd be happy. you're taking Miss Ellie away." Violet's voice was muffled by the pillow, thick with tears. "Everyone goes away. Mama went away, and now Miss Ellie will too." Eleanor's heart broke cleanly in half. She joined Jackson beside the bunk. Reached out to stroke Violet's tangled hair. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. That's why your papa and I are getting married, so I can stay here forever, so I can be your mama if you'll let me." Violet turned her head, her small face streaked with tears. "Forever, forever and ever," Eleanor promised. "I'm going to be here when you wake up every morning and when you go to sleep every night. I'm going to make you bread and teach you to sew and hold you when you have bad dreams. That's what marriage means. I'm choosing your papa, and I'm choosing you, and I'm choosing all of your brothers and sisters. We're going to be a real family, promise?" The word was barely a whisper. "I promise on my grandmother's Dutch oven, which is the most sacred promise I know how to make." Eleanor held out her arms. "Come here, little bird. Let me hold you." Violet launched herself into Eleanor's embrace with such force she nearly knocked them both over. The child clung to her with desperate strength, her small body shaking with the magnitude of her relief. Eleanor held her close and met Jackson's eyes over Violet's blonde head, saw her own emotions reflected there, love and fear and determination all tangled together. They were married 3 days later by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Silver Peak on his monthly rounds. It was a hasty affair, witnessed by the children and a handful of minors who'd grown fond of Eleanor's cooking. There was no white dress, no flowers, no celebration beyond the simple meal Eleanor prepared afterward. But when Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, and Jackson kissed her with careful tenderness while the children cheered, Eleanor felt something she'd never experienced in her marriage to Gerald. She felt chosen. The town's reaction was swift and predictably judgmental. Constance Colfax appeared at the bunkhouse 2 days after the wedding, her sharp features pinched with disapproval beneath her expensive bonnet. She didn't knock, just pushed through the door with the imperious air of someone who believed her social standing granted her universal access. "Mrs. Garrett," she said, investing Eleanor's new name with enough disdain to make it sound like an insult. "I've come to discuss your situation." Eleanor was elbow-deep in bread dough, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her generous forearms. She didn't pause in her kneading. "My situation seems quite clear, Mrs. Colfax. I'm married to Jackson Garrett, caring for his children and several orphans who desperately need stability." "Which part requires discussion?" Constance's lips thinned. "The part where you've entrapped a grieving widower into a hasty marriage to legitimize your presence in his household. The part where you've created a mockery of Christian values by, careful." Eleanor's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. She set down the dough and wiped her hands on her apron, never breaking eye contact with the older woman. "I'll tolerate many things, Mrs. Colfax, but I won't tolerate lies about my character or my marriage. I came to Silver Peak because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because 8 children needed care. I married Jackson Garrett because we both needed what the other could offer, partnership, companionship, and a chance to build something good from our losses. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, I suggest you leave and don't return. How dare you speak to me that way? I'm a respected member of this community, the wife of the mine owner." "You're a bully," Eleanor interrupted flatly. "You're a woman who uses her husband's money and position to terrorize people who can't fight back. But I'm not one of those people, Mrs. Colfax. I've already lost everything once. I have nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear from the likes of you." Constance's face flushed an ugly red. "We'll see about that. My husband has significant influence with the territorial authorities. One word from him, and those children will be removed from this household and placed in proper institutions where they can be raised with appropriate moral guidance. Those children are thriving for the first time in years," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "They're fed, clothed, educated, and loved. If you think tearing them away from the only stable home they've known serves any purpose beyond satisfying your own spite, then you're not just a bully, you're a monster. How dare, get out. Jackson's voice cut through the room like a blade. He filled the doorway, his face set in lines of stone, his gray eyes blazing with cold fury. Get out of my house, Mrs. Colfax, before I forget I'm trying to be a gentleman. Constance turned to face him, clearly preparing to deploy whatever weapons had worked on him in the past. But something in Jackson's expression made her pause. This wasn't the broken, grief-stricken man she'd encountered before. This was someone who'd found his strength again. Someone who would fight to protect what was his, your house. Constance's voice dripped venom. My husband owns this entire operation, Mr. Garrett. You'd do well to remember that, your husband owns the mine. This house, rough as it is, belongs to me. I built it with my own hands 7 years ago, before your husband ever set foot in Silver Peak. So yes, Mrs. Colfax, my house. And you're trespassing. Jackson stepped aside, gesturing to the open door. Leave. Now, for a moment Eleanor thought Constance might refuse, might escalate the confrontation into something even uglier. But whatever she saw in Jackson's face convinced her to retreat, for now. She swept toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster. Then paused on the threshold. This isn't over, she said. The territorial authorities will hear about this situation, mark my words. We'll see how long your little arrangement lasts once proper scrutiny is applied. She left in a rustle of expensive skirts, and Jackson closed the door firmly behind her. For a moment he just stood there, his back to Eleanor, his shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. When he finally turned, his expression was bleak. She means it, he said. Constance Colfax doesn't make idle threats. She'll write those letters, call in whatever favors her husband can buy, make as much trouble as possible, let her. Eleanor returned to her bread dough, channeling her anger into the physical act of kneading. We're married legally. The children are being properly cared for. What grounds could she possibly have for removing them? Eleanor, you don't understand how this works. The territorial authorities, they don't necessarily care about what's best for children. They care about appearances, about moral standards, about keeping powerful people like Hiram Colfax happy. His hands clenched into fists. And if they decide there's something improper about our arrangement, they have the power to take Violet, to take all of them, and there's not a damn thing we can do to stop them. The fear in his voice chilled Eleanor to her core. She'd been so focused on the immediate challenges, feeding the children, managing the household, navigating her growing feelings for Jackson, that she hadn't fully grasped the precariousness of their situation. These children, who'd finally found stability and happiness, could be ripped away on the whim of a vindictive woman and her enabling husband. Then we make ourselves unassailable, Eleanor said, forcing determination into her voice. We make sure every aspect of this household is beyond reproach. We document everything, the children's education, their health, their improvements since I arrived. We get testimonials from the miners, from Judge Morrison, from anyone who can speak to the quality of care we're providing. And we prepare to fight if it comes to that. Jackson crossed to her, pulled her into his arms despite the flour covering her hands and apron. I don't know what I did to deserve you, he said against her hair. But I'm grateful for it every day. Eleanor leaned into his strength, let herself take comfort from his solid presence. You showed up when I needed someone to take a chance on me. That's not nothing, Jackson. That's everything. They stood that way for several minutes, drawing strength from each other, until the sound of children's voices outside reminded them that life continued regardless of Constance Colfax's threats. Eleanor pulled away reluctantly and returned to her bread, while Jackson went to supervise the older boys wood chopping. But the specter of separation hung over the household now, a shadow that darkened even the brightest moments. December arrived with vengeance, bringing storms that buried Silver Peak under drifts of snow so deep the children could barely see over them. The miners worked shorter shifts, the cold making deep underground work treacherous. Food supplies grew tight as the weekly supply wagon from Denver became increasingly unreliable. Eleanor stretched their stores with the creativity born of necessity, making soup from bones she'd normally discard, baking bread that was more air than substance, rationing the precious sugar and coffee until they were luxuries reserved for Sunday mornings. Through it all, Jackson revealed depths of tenderness that surprised her. He carved each child a set of wooden animals for Christmas, working late into the nights by lamplight, his scarred hands moving with unexpected delicacy. He mended Eleanor's boots when the soles wore through, adding extra leather so they'd last the winter. He started sleeping in the main room of the bunkhouse instead of in his separate quarters, close enough to hear if Violet woke with nightmares, present in a way he hadn't been since Clara's death, and late at night, after the children were asleep, he would sit with Eleanor by the stove and talk about Clara and the life they'd built together, about his fears for Violet's future. About his dreams of expanding the mine into something that could support proper schools and doctors for the camp. Eleanor shared her own stories in return, the good memories of Philadelphia before Gerald's gambling destroyed everything, her grandmother's wisdom, her own dreams of having a home that felt permanent and secure. "I never thought I'd have this again," Jackson admitted one night, his hand finding Eleanor's in the darkness. "This feeling of being part of something larger than myself, of having a purpose beyond just surviving, I know what you mean." Eleanor laced her fingers through his, marveling at how natural it felt. "In Philadelphia, after Gerald died, I felt like a ghost. Present but not really alive, just going through motions until something finally put me out of my misery. Coming here, caring for these children, building a life with you, it's like waking up after a long, terrible dream." He raised her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her palm. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Eleanor Garrett. Stronger than Clara in different ways, though I loved her deeply. You've survived things that would have broken most people, and you've somehow kept your capacity for kindness and hope intact. That's remarkable." The comparison to Clara should have stung, but instead it felt like a gift, acknowledgement that Eleanor wasn't trying to replace Jackson's first wife but rather creating something new beside the memory of her. "Clara must have been extraordinary to inspire such devotion," Eleanor said softly. "She was. But so are you." Jackson's gray eyes caught the firelight, reflecting warmth Eleanor had never seen in them before. "I need you to know that this marriage, it started as necessity, yes, but it's become something more for me. You're not just convenient or useful, Eleanor. He struggled for words, his rough features softening with emotion. "You're essential. You're the reason I remember how to breathe properly." A crash from outside cut off his declaration. Both of them froze, listening. Then came a sound that made Eleanor's blood run cold, Violet screaming in absolute terror. They bolted for the door, Jackson reaching it first and yanking it open to reveal chaos. The crude stable where they kept the 2 horses and 3 goats was engulfed in flames, fire licking up the wooden walls with terrifying speed. And there, silhouetted against the orange glow, stood Violet in her thin nightgown, having somehow slipped outside without anyone noticing. "Daisy," she screamed, referring to the kid goat she'd adopted as her special pet. "Daisy's inside, Violet, get back." Eleanor ran forward, but Violet was already moving, her small body darting toward the burning building with the single-minded determination of a child who'd already lost too much. Jackson reached her first. Scooped her up bodily despite her flailing limbs and desperate cries. "No, little bird, you can't go in there, but Daisy. Daisy's scared. She needs me." The other children had spilled out of the bunkhouse now, drawn by the screams and the unnatural brightness. Sarah held Thomas, her face white with shock. Robert and Luke were already running for water buckets, though everyone knew it was likely too late to save the structure. The flames had spread too quickly, fueled by dry hay and ancient wood. Eleanor made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. She grabbed a blanket from the clothesline, soaked it quickly in the horse trough, and wrapped it around her head and shoulders. "Eleanor, no." Jackson's voice was sharp with command and fear. "It's not worth your life, that goat is worth Violet's heart," Eleanor shot back. "And I've already died once in Philadelphia. I'm not afraid of doing it again for her." She plunged into the burning stable before Jackson could stop her, before her own fear could paralyze her. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke choking, the crackling roar of the fire drowning out all other sounds. Eleanor could barely see through the tears streaming from her stinging eyes, but she pushed forward, following the terrified bleating she could just barely hear over the inferno. Daisy was in the back corner, a small white shape pressed against the wall, frozen with terror. Eleanor grabbed the kid roughly, tucked the struggling animal against her chest beneath the wet blanket, and turned to run back out. But in the few seconds she'd been inside, a beam had fallen across the doorway, blocking the exit she'd used. Panic clawed at Eleanor's throat. The air was getting thinner, the heat more intense. Her lungs burned with every breath. Through the smoke she could see another opening, a gap in the wall where fire had burned through, but it was small, so small, and she wasn't a small woman. She'd have to squeeze through, and if she got stuck, no time for doubt. Eleanor pushed Daisy through first, heard the goat's frightened bleat from the other side. Then she forced her own body into the gap, felt the burning wood scrape against her hips and shoulders, felt her nightdress catch and tear. For one terrible moment she was stuck, trapped between fire and freedom, and she understood with crystal clarity that she was about to die in a burning stable in Colorado, far from everything she'd known, for the love of a child who wasn't even biologically hers. Then hands grabbed her arms, Jackson's hands, impossibly strong, and pulled with enough force to hurt. She came free in a rush, tumbling forward into the snow, the cold air hitting her scorched skin like salvation itself. Jackson pulled her away from the building, away from the heat and danger. And they collapsed together in the snow 20 feet from the inferno. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman," Jackson gasped, his arms tight around her. "You could have died. You could have left me." His voice broke completely. "Don't ever do that again. Promise me. Nothing is worth your life. Violet's happiness is worth my life," Eleanor wheezed, her lungs raw from smoke. "Those children are worth my life. You're worth my life." She coughed violently, her chest aching. "Where's Daisy?" "Here." Violet appeared beside them, the rescued goat clutched in her arms, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "Miss Ellie, Mama, you saved her. You went into the fire for her." Eleanor reached out with a shaking hand to stroke Violet's hair. "Of course I did, little bird. That's what mothers do. We go into the fire for our children." Violet set down the goat and threw herself at Eleanor, sobbing into her shoulder with the force of every loss and fear she'd carried for her young life. "Don't leave me," she cried. "Please don't leave me like Mama did, never." Eleanor held her daughter, for Violet was truly her daughter now, bound not by blood but by choice and sacrifice, and made a promise she intended to keep. "I will never leave you, Violet Garrett. You're stuck with me forever, whether you like it or not." Behind them, the stable collapsed in on itself with a groan and a shower of sparks that lit up the night sky. The horses and remaining goats had been saved, driven out by Robert and Luke before the fire spread. Only the building was lost, and buildings could be rebuilt. Lives couldn't. Jackson helped Eleanor to her feet, supported her weight as her burned and battered body registered what she'd put it through. Sarah appeared with blankets, wrapped them around Eleanor's shoulders, her young face showing maturity beyond her years. The other children clustered close, their family circle tight and protective. "She risked her life for Violet's goat," James said with awe. "Mama Eleanor really is our mama now." It was the first time any of them had called her that, and the word hung in the cold air like a benediction. Eleanor looked at the faces surrounding her, Violet's tear-streaked joy, Sarah's fierce pride, the boys' newfound respect, even baby Thomas reaching out with chubby hands to touch her sooty face. This was her family. These were her children. And she would walk through fire for them again and again if necessary. Yes, Jackson said, his arm tightening around Eleanor's waist. She is our mother now. And anyone who tries to say otherwise, anyone who tries to take you children away from her or from me, will have to go through both of us first. The threat was clear, the promise absolute. They would protect this family they'd built from the ashes of their individual losses. They would fight whatever battles needed fighting. Face whatever authorities came calling, stand together against anything that threatened their fragile, precious happiness. In the morning, they would discover that the fire had been deliberately set, that someone had splashed kerosene against the stable wall and struck a match. They would find out that Constance Colfax's ne'er-do-well nephew had been seen lurking around the property that evening, that several miners had witnessed his hasty departure right before the flames started. The truth would come out slowly, piece by piece, building a case that would eventually force even Hiram Colfax to acknowledge his family's culpability. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, Eleanor simply stood in the snow with her husband's arm around her and her children pressed close, watching the fire burn itself out while the first stars appeared overhead. She'd survived Philadelphia's judgment, survived the journey west, survived poverty and grief, and now fire itself. She was done running, done apologizing, done accepting less than she deserved. Eleanor Garrett had found her place in the world, and heaven help anyone who tried to take it from her. The evidence of arson came to light 3 days after the fire, when a miner named Pete Sullivan approached Jackson at the mine entrance with his hat in his hands and guilt written across his weathered face. Eleanor watched from the bunkhouse window as the two men talked, saw Jackson's body go rigid with fury, saw his hands clench into fists that could have pulverized stone. When he came inside, his face was set in lines so harsh he looked like a stranger. The children scattered instinctively, sensing the rage barely contained beneath his surface calm. Only Eleanor stood her ground, waiting. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Pete saw Colt Drayton, Constance's nephew, pouring something against the stable wall that night. Smelled like kerosene. Pete thought Colt was just being helpful, maybe treating the wood against rot, so he didn't think anything of it until the fire started." Jackson's voice was deadly calm, which somehow made it more frightening. Then he was too scared to come forward because Hiram Colfax signs his pay voucher and he's got a wife and 3 children to feed. Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. "They tried to kill us. They set a fire that could have burned down the bunkhouse with the children inside. They tried to make it look like an accident. Probably thought it would scare you away, prove you weren't fit to care for children if you couldn't keep them safe." Jackson slammed his fist against the table, making the dishes jump. "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to find Colt Drayton and I'm going to, no." Eleanor crossed to him, placed her hands on his chest, felt his heart pounding like a war drum beneath her palms. "That's exactly what they want. You assault Colt, you give them grounds to have you arrested, to take the children away because their guardian is a violent criminal. We have to be smarter than that, Jackson. We have to beat them the right way. There is no right way." His voice rose, and several children peeked around corners, their faces frightened. "They nearly killed you, Eleanor. They nearly killed Violet. They set fire to my property and endangered 8 children, and you want me to what? Be reasonable. Follow proper channels. There's no justice in this godforsaken territory for people like us, then we make our own justice." Eleanor kept her voice steady, kept her hands firm on his chest. "We go to Judge Morrison with Pete's testimony. We document everything. We make so much noise that even the territorial authorities can't ignore it. And we do it the legal way, so they can't claim we're the problem." Jackson stared at her for a long moment, his breathing ragged, his fury still burning hot. Then, gradually, his shoulders sagged. "You're right. I know you're right. But God help me, Eleanor, I've never wanted to hurt someone so badly in my life, I know. I feel the same way. Eleanor pulled him into her arms, held him while the rage slowly drained away into something more sustainable, cold determination. But we're not going to give them the satisfaction of destroying ourselves. We're going to fight smart, and we're going to win. The journey to town the next morning felt like riding into battle. Jackson and Eleanor left the older children in charge, wrapped themselves in every warm layer they owned, and set out on the 2 remaining horses through snow that came up to the animals' knees. The cold bit through Eleanor's new green coat with teeth sharp as betrayal, but she kept her spine straight and her chin up, refused to show any weakness. Judge Morrison's temporary office occupied a corner of the general store, a makeshift space he used during his monthly circuits through the mountain camps. The old man looked up from his paperwork as they entered, his eyes sharpening when he saw their grim expressions. Mr. and Mrs. Garrett. I had a feeling I'd be seeing you soon. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Sit. Tell me everything. They did, laying out the whole story, Constance's threats, the suspicious fire, Pete Sullivan's testimony, the increasing harassment that had plagued them since their marriage. Eleanor kept her voice level and factual, presenting each piece of evidence like a lawyer building a case. When she finished, Judge Morrison sat back in his chair and studied them both with eyes that had seen too much human ugliness to be easily shocked. This is serious, he said finally. Arson is a territorial crime. If we can prove Colt Drayton set that fire, he'll face prison time. Can we prove it? Jackson asked. Pete's willing to testify, but will his word be enough against the Colfax family's money and influence? Depends on what else we can find. I'll need to interview Pete myself, examine the fire site, talk to other witnesses. Morrison tapped his fingers on the desk. The problem is timing. My circuit takes me away from Silver Peak for the next 3 weeks. By the time I get back, by then the Colfaxes will have had time to intimidate Pete into silence, destroy any remaining evidence, and spin their own version of events. Eleanor's voice was bitter. We've seen this before, Your Honor. In Philadelphia, I watched wealthy people destroy lives with impunity because the system protected them and not their victims. I'm not Philadelphia, Morrison said with quiet steel. And I don't take kindly to attempted murder disguised as accident. Give me 2 days to gather what information I can before I leave. In the meantime, I want you both to document everything. Keep a detailed record of any threats, any suspicious activity, any contact with the Colfax family. If they come after you again, I want evidence. They left the judge's office with hope tempered by realism. 2 days wasn't much time, and the Colfaxes had already proven they weren't afraid to escalate. Eleanor felt eyes following them as they walked through town, saw curtains twitch in windows, heard whispers that stopped abruptly when they drew close. Silver Peak had chosen sides, and most of the town was betting on money and power rather than justice and truth. Mrs. Garrett. The voice came from behind them, sharp and cultured and dripping with false sweetness. How fortunate to run into you. Eleanor turned to find Constance Colfax standing in front of the millinery shop, flanked by 2 other well-dressed women who looked at Eleanor with the same contempt one might reserve for something scraped off a boot. Constance's smile didn't reach her eyes, and her gloved hands were clasped so tightly the leather stretched white across her knuckles. Mrs. Colfax. Eleanor kept her voice neutral, though her pulse quickened. If you'll excuse us, we have business to attend to. Oh, I'm sure you do. Running to the judge with wild accusations, I hear. Constance's voice carried, pitched deliberately loud enough for the other people on the street to hear. It must be difficult, living with such paranoia. First you claim we're trying to take your children away, now you're accusing my family of arson. What's next? Will you blame us for the weather too? I'm not claiming anything. Eleanor forced herself to stay calm. I'm simply reporting facts to the appropriate authorities and letting them investigate. If your family has nothing to hide, I'm sure the truth will exonerate you. The truth? Constance laughed, and the sound was ugly. The truth is that you're a disgraced woman from Philadelphia who entrapped a grieving widower into marriage, and now you're trying to destroy anyone who questions your motives. The truth is that those poor children deserve better than a stepmother who's so reckless she nearly gets them killed in a fire. That's enough. Jackson's voice cut through the air like a gunshot. He stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of Eleanor, his body language radiating protective fury. You will not speak to my wife that way, or what, Mr. Garrett? Will you threaten me? Strike me perhaps? Constance's smile turned vicious. Please do. I have witnesses here who would love to testify to your violent nature when the authorities come to evaluate your fitness as a guardian. It was a trap, Eleanor realized with cold clarity. Constance was deliberately provoking Jackson, trying to goad him into an action that would justify all her previous accusations. She'd probably rehearsed this encounter, planned every word to maximize the damage. The two women flanking her weren't just friends, they were witnesses, carefully positioned to corroborate whatever story Constance wanted to tell. Jackson. Eleanor placed her hand on her husband's arm, felt the muscles bunched tight as wire beneath his coat. Let's go. She's not worth it. Listen to your wife, Mr. Garrett. She at least has some sense, even if her morals are questionable. Constance took a step closer, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. You know, if you just send her packing back to Philadelphia where she belongs, all of this unpleasantness could end. The children would be better off with a proper woman running that household, someone from a good family with appropriate values. I'm sure arrangements could be made. The only arrangement I want to make with you involves you and your whole rotten family leaving my town and never coming back. Jackson's voice was low and deadly. You want to know what happened the night of that fire? Your nephew Colt was seen pouring kerosene on my stable wall. Pete Sullivan witnessed the whole thing. So you can drop this pretense of innocence, Mrs. Colfax, because we both know exactly what kind of people you are. Constance's face went pale, then flushed an ugly red. That's a lie. My nephew would never. Your nephew is a coward and an arsonist, which makes you an accomplice to attempted murder. Eleanor stepped forward now, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. You wanted to scare me away, wanted to prove I couldn't protect those children. But all you did was prove that you're willing to endanger innocent lives to satisfy your own spite. That makes you worse than anything you've accused me of being. You have no proof. But Constance's voice had lost its confidence, and her eyes darted nervously to her companions. We have a witness. We have evidence. And we have Judge Morrison investigating. Eleanor took another step forward, closing the distance until she could see the fear flickering behind Constance's bravado. You made a mistake, Mrs. Colfax. You underestimated me because I'm not from your social class, because I have a fuller figure than your society deems appropriate, because I came here desperate and alone. But I've survived things you can't even imagine, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. This isn't over, Constance hissed, but she was already backing away. My husband, your husband will hear about this regardless of what you tell him, Jackson interrupted. Because Judge Morrison is launching a formal investigation, and the territorial authorities will be notified. So I suggest you go home and tell Hiram to lawyer up. Because we're coming for justice with everything we've got. Constance turned and fled, there was no other word for it. She practically ran down the street, her two companions hurrying after her, their heads bent together in urgent whispered conversation. Other townspeople who'd witnessed the confrontation stared with open mouths, some looking shocked, others thoughtful, a few openly pleased to see the high and mighty Constance Colfax put in her place. Eleanor's legs suddenly felt weak, and she swayed slightly. Jackson caught her immediately, his arm around her waist providing both physical and emotional support. You were magnificent, he said quietly. Absolutely magnificent. I was terrified, Eleanor admitted. My hands are still shaking. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs doing despite the fear. He pressed a kiss to her temple, right there in the middle of the street where anyone could see. "I'm proud of you, Eleanor Garrett. Proud to call you my wife." They rode back to the bunkhouse through the early afternoon cold, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt truly powerful, not because she'd been cruel or vindictive, but because she'd stood her ground and spoken truth in the face of lies and intimidation. Constance Colfax had tried to break her. Tried to use shame and social pressure as weapons, but Eleanor had refused to be broken. The children greeted their return with relief that bordered on panic. Sarah had kept things running smoothly, but the strain showed in her young face. Robert and Luke had spent the morning standing guard with hunting rifles, watching for any sign of trouble. Even little Violet had been on high alert, jumping at every unexpected sound. "It's all right," Eleanor assured them, gathering the children close. "We've spoken to Judge Morrison. He's investigating what happened, and the truth is going to come out. But in the meantime, we need to be vigilant and careful. No one goes anywhere alone, no one talks to strangers. And if you see Colt Drayton or anyone from the Colfax family, you come get me or your father immediately. Understood?" 8 heads nodded solemnly. They understood danger in a way children shouldn't have to, had already learned too young that the world could be cruel and unfair. But they also understood family and loyalty and fighting for what mattered. These weren't soft, sheltered children anymore, they were survivors, hardened by loss but not broken by it. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. Judge Morrison interviewed Pete Sullivan, examined the fire site, and spoke with several other miners who'd noticed suspicious activity around the Garrett property in the weeks leading up to the fire. Eleanor documented everything as instructed, keeping a detailed log of every threatening comment. Every suspicious glance, every incident that suggested harassment. Jackson worked on rebuilding the stable, helped by miners who showed up without being asked, bringing lumber and nails and labor. It was a quiet statement of solidarity. These rough men who'd seen Eleanor feed them when they were hungry, who'd watched her transform the bunkhouse from squalor to home, who'd witnessed her run into a burning building to save a child's pet. They might not have much power against the Colfax money, but they could swing hammers and raise walls, and that was a form of justice too. On the 3rd day, as Judge Morrison was preparing to leave on his circuit, a rider came galloping into Silver Peak with news that sent shockwaves through the entire camp. Hiram Colfax had been arrested by territorial marshals in Denver on charges of embezzlement and fraud. An audit of his mining operations had revealed years of stolen wages, falsified records, and money laundered through fake supply companies. The investigation had been ongoing for months, but new evidence had finally given authorities enough to act. The news spread through Silver Peak like wildfire, and by evening a crowd had gathered outside the Colfax mansion, a grand structure that towered over the rough mining camp like a monument to stolen wealth. Eleanor and Jackson watched from a distance as Constance was escorted to a waiting carriage by territorial deputies, her face hidden behind a veil. Her imperious posture finally broken. "They're taking her to Denver," Pete Sullivan said, appearing beside them. Heard the deputies talking. "Hiram's already singing like a canary, trying to cut a deal by implicating his business partners. Sounds like half the mine owners in Colorado are going to be investigated before this is done." "What about Colt?" Eleanor asked. "What happens to him?" Judge Morrison issued a warrant this morning. "Colt's been charged with arson based on my testimony and the physical evidence at the fire site. They'll pick him up in Denver. That's where he ran to when he heard his uncle was arrested." Pete turned his hat in his hands, his expression sheepish. "I should have come forward sooner, Mrs. Garrett. I knew it was wrong to stay silent. You have a family to protect. I understand." Eleanor placed her hand on his arm. "But you did come forward eventually, and that took courage. Thank you, Pete. Your testimony might have saved our lives." The old miner's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "You're a good woman, Mrs. Garrett. Best thing that's happened to this camp in years. Those children are lucky to have you." as Pete walked away, Jackson pulled Eleanor close against his side. They stood together watching the Colfax carriage disappear down the mountain road, carrying away the woman who tried to destroy them. Around them, miners and their families emerged from homes and boarding houses, talking excitedly about the fall of Silver Peak's first family, about the wages they might finally recover, about the possibility of new ownership that might actually treat them fairly. "It's over," Jackson said, but his voice held a question. "Not quite." Eleanor thought about the territorial authorities who'd been receiving Constance's letters, about the investigation that might still be pending into their household, about the countless ways the powerful could still make trouble even from prison. "But we've won this battle. The Colfaxes can't hurt us anymore, and that's something, more than something. It's everything." Jackson turned her to face him, his gray eyes intense in the fading light. "You know what I realized today? When we were facing down Constance in the street, when you stood there and refused to back down, what? That I'm in love with you." The words came out rough and uncertain, as if he wasn't quite sure how to say them. "Not just grateful for what you do, not just companionship or partnership. I'm in love with you, Eleanor Garrett. Completely, terrifyingly in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught. They'd never spoken of love before, had built their marriage on practical foundations of mutual need and respect. But somewhere along the way, between the bread baking and the child rearing and the fire fighting, something deeper had taken root. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to say it, too worried that admitting it would somehow jinx things or make it hurt more if it all fell apart." "Nothing's falling apart." Jackson cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks with infinite tenderness. "We're building something stronger than fear, Eleanor. We're building a family and a life and a love that can survive anything the world throws at us." He kissed her then, not the careful pecks they'd exchanged before but a real kiss, deep and claiming and full of promise. Eleanor melted into it, let herself feel the full weight of her love for this complicated, damaged, beautiful man who'd taken a chance on her when she had nothing left to offer but desperation and determination. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and grinning, they found 8 children staring at them from the bunkhouse window, their faces pressed against the glass like a row of gossipy cherubs. Sarah was smirking, Robert and Luke were making exaggerated gagging noises, and Violet was bouncing up and down with excitement. "Well," Eleanor said, laughing, "I suppose that secret's out. Good." Jackson took her hand, laced their fingers together. "I'm tired of hiding how I feel. Let the whole damn territory know. I'm a man in love with his wife, and I'm not ashamed of it." They walked back to the bunkhouse hand in hand, toward the warmth and noise and chaos of their family. The door opened before they reached it, children spilling out into the cold to pepper them with questions and observations and excited chatter. Somewhere in the distance, the mine whistle blew to signal the end of the day shift. The smell of bread baking drifted from the kitchen window, and Violet's goat Daisy bleated from her temporary pen near the new stable's foundation. This was home, Eleanor thought as she was enveloped by small bodies and happy voices. Not perfect, not easy, but real and solid and worth fighting for. She'd lost everything in Philadelphia, her reputation, her possessions, her illusions about life being fair or just. But she'd found something infinitely more valuable here in the rough mountains of Colorado. She'd found herself. She'd found her strength. She'd found a man who loved her not despite her flaws but because of the whole complicated package she represented. And she'd found children who needed her as much as she needed them, who taught her that family wasn't about biology or social standing but about showing up day after day with love and determination and the willingness to run into burning buildings if that's what it took. The battle with the Colfaxes might be over, but Eleanor knew their story was just beginning. There would be other challenges ahead, harsh winters and food shortages and all the countless difficulties of life on the frontier. But they would face those challenges together, as a family, united by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than convenience. As Eleanor stepped into the warm kitchen and began preparing supper while children swirled around her like happy chaos, she sent a silent prayer of thanks to whatever providence had led her to that 12-word advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper. She'd answered it out of desperation, expecting nothing more than survival. What she'd found was redemption. Spring arrived in Silver Peak with the subtlety of a revelation, the snow melting away to reveal earth that had been buried since before Eleanor's arrival. With the thaw came news that spread through the mining camp with the speed of good gossip. The territorial investigation had cleared the Garrett household of any wrongdoing. And more than that, had commended Jackson and Eleanor for their exemplary care of the orphaned children. Judge Morrison delivered the letter himself, riding up to the bunkhouse on a warm April morning with a smile that transformed his usually stern face. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Garrett," he said, handing the official document to Jackson. "The territorial authorities have not only dismissed all complaints against you, but they've also approved your household as an official fostering arrangement. That means you'll receive a small stipend for each child in your care, and you'll have legal standing to protect them from any future interference." Eleanor read the letter over Jackson's shoulder. Her eyes blurring with tears she refused to shed in front of the judge. After months of fear and uncertainty, after the fire and the confrontations and the sleepless nights worrying that they might lose the children, they'd finally won something more permanent than victory. They'd won legitimacy. "What about the Colfaxes?" Jackson asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Hiram will be in prison for at least 15 years, probably more. Constance has returned to her family back east, thoroughly disgraced. As for Colt Drayton, he's been sentenced to 5 years for arson." Morrison's expression hardened. "He's lucky it wasn't longer." The judge took into consideration his cooperation in testifying against his uncle. "But make no mistake, he'll serve time for what he did to your family." After the judge left, Eleanor and Jackson simply stood in the doorway holding the letter, letting the enormity of their victory sink in. The children had gathered behind them, reading the news in their postures, and when Eleanor turned to face them with tears now streaming freely down her face, they erupted into cheers that could probably be heard all the way down in Denver. "We're safe," Sarah breathed, her young face showing relief too profound for someone so young. "They can't take us away anymore." "Never," Eleanor said fiercely, pulling Sarah into her arms. "You're ours now, officially and forever. All of you." The celebration that followed was spontaneous and joyful, the kind of pure happiness that comes from surviving something terrible and emerging stronger on the other side. Robert and Luke hooped and wrestled like puppies. Henry and James ran outside to spread the news to anyone who would listen. Meg actually laughed, a sound Eleanor had never heard from the quiet girl, and even baby Thomas seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, gurgling happily in his cradle, but it was Violet's reaction that undid Eleanor completely. The little girl climbed onto Eleanor's lap, pressed her small hands to either side of Eleanor's face, and said with absolute solemnity, "You're my real mama now. Not just pretend mama. Real mama forever, forever and ever," Eleanor promised, her voice breaking. "Nothing in this world could take me away from you, little bird." Jackson watched this exchange with an expression Eleanor had learned to recognize, part grief for Clara, part gratitude for Eleanor, all love for the child they shared between them. He crossed to them, wrapped his arms around both Eleanor and Violet, and for a moment they simply existed as a family, complete and whole and unbreakable. The weeks that followed brought changes that transformed not just the Garrett household but all of Silver Peak. With Hiram Colfax gone, the mine was purchased by a consortium of Denver businessmen who actually believed in fair wages and safe working conditions. The miners celebrated with a raucousness that lasted 3 days, and Eleanor's kitchen became the unofficial headquarters for the festivities as she churned out bread and stew and coffee for dozens of grateful men who treated her like a conquering hero. "You started this, you know," Pete Sullivan told her one evening as he sat at her kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee. "When you stood up to Constance in the street, when you refused to be intimidated or shamed, it gave the rest of us courage. We started talking to each other, comparing notes about the wages we weren't receiving, the safety violations we'd been too scared to report. You showed us that fighting back was possible." Eleanor felt her face heat with embarrassment. "I was just trying to protect my family," that's what we all were doing. But you did it first, and you did it loud enough that we couldn't ignore it anymore." Pete raised his cup in salute. To Mrs. Eleanor Garrett, the woman who broke the Colfax Empire with nothing but courage and a Dutch oven, the toast was taken up by the other miners present, and Eleanor had to excuse herself to the back room before she dissolved into tears in front of everyone. Jackson found her there a few minutes later, pressed against the wall with her hand over her mouth to muffle the sobs. "What's wrong?" His hands were gentle on her shoulders, turning her to face him. "Eleanor, talk to me, nothing's wrong. Everything's right, and I don't know how to handle it." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. 6 months ago I was standing in a Philadelphia courthouse being called a fraud and a thief. I had nothing, no money, no home, no future, no hope. And now look at me. I have a husband I love, children who call me mama, a community that respects me. How did this happen, Jackson? How did I get so lucky? Luck had nothing to do with it." He pulled her against his chest, let her cry into his shirt. "You survived because you're strong. You thrived because you're brilliant and kind and braver than anyone I've ever met. You earned every bit of happiness you have. Eleanor. Don't ever think otherwise. I just wish," she stopped, swallowed hard. "I wish my grandmother could see this. She always believed I was stronger than I thought I was, but I never believed her until now." "She knew," Jackson said softly. "She gave you that Dutch oven knowing you'd need it someday, knowing it would be the tool that saved you. She saw this future for you, Eleanor. She just didn't live long enough to witness it." The thought comforted her more than it should have. Eleanor let herself lean into Jackson's strength for a few more minutes, then straightened her spine and wiped her face clean. There were miners in her kitchen waiting for coffee, children who needed supper. A life that required her presence and participation. She could cry about her blessings later, in the privacy of the night when Jackson held her and the children slept safely in their bunks. May brought warmth that felt like a gift after the brutal winter, and with it came a surprise visitor that changed everything once more. Eleanor was in the garden, a new addition to the property, carefully tended beds where she was trying to coax vegetables from the stubborn mountain soil, when she heard a wagon approaching. She looked up to see an unfamiliar vehicle drawn by 2 horses, driven by a woman in expensive traveling clothes who looked completely out of place in the rough mining camp. The woman climbed down from the wagon with practiced grace, despite her obviously advanced pregnancy, and walked directly toward Eleanor with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. She was beautiful in a refined way that reminded Eleanor painfully of Philadelphia society: perfect hair, perfect posture, expensive jewelry glinting at her throat and wrists. "Mrs. Eleanor Garrett?" the woman asked, her voice cultured and uncertain. "Yes." Eleanor stood, brushing dirt from her apron, suddenly conscious of her work-roughened hands and flour-dusted dress. "Can I help you? My name is Margaret Hartwell." The woman paused, seemed to gather courage. "I'm here about my son. Robert Hartwell. I believe you've been caring for him." The world tilted sideways. Eleanor stared at this elegant stranger and understood with sinking certainty what was about to happen. Robert's mother had come to take him home. "Robert is inside with his father and siblings," Eleanor managed to say. "Would you like to come in?" Margaret followed her into the bunkhouse, her eyes widening as she took in the clean, organized space that bore no resemblance to the chaos Robert must have described in his infrequent letters home. The children were gathered around the table for their afternoon lessons, Sarah teaching the younger ones their letters while Robert and Luke worked on arithmetic problems Eleanor had set for them. Robert looked up when they entered, and his face went through a complicated series of emotions when he saw his mother: surprise, joy, fear, and something that looked almost like guilt. "Ma," he said, his voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you, sweetheart. And to meet the people who've been taking care of you." Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. "I came to take you home." The silence that fell over the room was heavy enough to crush stone. Robert's face had gone pale, and he looked from his mother to Eleanor with an expression that broke Eleanor's heart clean through. "Home," he repeated. "But Ma, I am home." Margaret's carefully composed expression crumbled. "Robert, I've been working myself to death in Denver trying to make enough money to send for you. I've been sewing and taking in laundry and doing whatever work I could find, saving every penny. It's taken me 2 years, but I finally have enough for us to start over together. I have a small apartment, and I've secured steady employment as a seamstress. We can be a family again. We are a family." Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Me and Pa and Mama Eleanor and all of them. We're a family." The words, Mama Eleanor, landed like a physical blow on Margaret's face. Eleanor saw the pain there, the jealousy, the fear that she'd been replaced in her own son's heart. She knew that pain intimately, knew what it felt like to be replaced and forgotten, even if the circumstances were completely different. "Robert," Eleanor said gently, "your mother has worked very hard to be able to provide for you again. That's an act of love. You should hear her out, but I don't want to leave." Robert's voice rose, and suddenly all the children were talking at once, Sarah protesting that Robert couldn't go, Luke saying they needed him, even little Violet beginning to cry because she didn't understand what was happening but knew it was bad. Jackson appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion from the new stable he'd been working on. He took in the scene with swift comprehension, the elegant stranger. Robert's distress, Eleanor's careful neutrality, and his expression hardened. "Everyone outside," he said firmly. Except Robert, his mother, and Eleanor. Now, the children filed out reluctantly, and Jackson followed them, closing the door behind him to give them privacy. Eleanor gestured for Margaret to sit at the table, then sat across from her with Robert standing between them like a bridge connecting two different lives. "Mrs. Hartwell," Eleanor began carefully, "I want you to know that Robert has been a blessing to this household. He's been responsible and kind, a good role model for the younger children. We love him dearly, but he's my son." Margaret's voice shook. "My child. I never wanted to send him away, but after his father died in the mine and I had no way to support us both, I had no choice. I thought," she wiped at her eyes, trying to maintain her composure. "I thought it would be temporary. A few months at most. But months turned into years, and every day I wasn't with him felt like dying. Now I finally have the means to care for him properly, and you're saying he doesn't want to come home? This is his home now, Ma," Robert said, his voice breaking. "I know you worked hard, and I'm grateful, truly I am. But I've been here 2 years. These people, they're my family. Mama Eleanor taught me to read properly, helped me with my numbers, made me feel like I mattered. Pa Jackson showed me how to work with wood, how to be responsible for the younger kids. Sarah and Luke and all the others, they need me. I can't just abandon them." Eleanor watched Margaret's face crumble further with each word, saw the woman's worst fears being confirmed. Her son had found a new mother, a new father, a new family that he loved more than he loved her. It was every parent's nightmare, and Eleanor felt it keenly because she understood both sides of this terrible equation. "Robert," Eleanor said quietly, "could you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with your mother privately." Robert hesitated, clearly worried about what might be said in his absence, but finally nodded and left. Once the door closed behind him, Eleanor leaned forward and met Margaret's eyes directly. "I know what you're feeling right now," she said. "You're terrified that you've lost your son, that the love and sacrifice you poured into trying to provide for him wasn't enough, that someone else stole your place in his heart. But Mrs. Hartwell, that's not what happened here." "Then what did happen?" Margaret's voice was raw with pain. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my son has replaced me with you. He hasn't replaced you. He's expanded his capacity to love to include more people." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "When Robert came here, he was lost and grieving and terrified. He'd lost his father, been separated from his mother, and didn't know if he'd ever have a real family again. We gave him stability and love and a sense of belonging. But we never tried to replace you, Margaret. Every lesson I taught him, every meal I cooked, every time I praised his accomplishments, I did all of that knowing he had a mother somewhere who loved him desperately. Then why won't he come home with me? Because home isn't a place, it's people. And right now, Robert's home includes both you and us. He's not choosing between families, Margaret. He's trying to figure out how to keep both. Eleanor paused, let that sink in. What if you didn't have to take him away? What if there was another option? Margaret stared at her. What are you suggesting? Stay here. In Silver Peak. The idea was forming even as Eleanor spoke it, feeling both crazy and perfectly right. You said you're a seamstress. This camp is full of miners who need their clothes mended, who'd pay good money for someone with real skill. You could set up a shop here, build a life near your son without tearing him away from the family he's built. That way Robert gets both of us, his birth mother and his found family. That way everyone wins. I couldn't. Margaret stopped, reconsidered. Could I? Is there even space for that kind of business here? There's a building sitting empty since the Colfaxes left. Used to be Constance's private parlor where she'd receive visitors and pretend to be a grand lady. It's well built, has good light, right in the center of town. I'm sure the new mine owners would lease it for reasonable terms. Eleanor reached across the table, took Margaret's hand. I'm not trying to keep your son from you. I'm trying to give him the chance to have both his mothers. Let me help you, Margaret. Let us help you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. Why would you do this? Why would you help me when I'm here to take away a child you clearly love? Because I know what it's like to lose everything, Eleanor said simply. And because I know what it's like to be given a second chance when you least expect it. You deserve that chance, Margaret. You deserve to be near your son, to watch him grow up, to be part of his life. And Robert deserves to have his mother back without losing the family he's found here. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, two mothers who'd been pitted against each other by circumstance finding common ground in their shared love for a boy who needed them both. Finally, Margaret squeezed Eleanor's hand and nodded. All right, she said. I'll stay. I'll try to make this work. When Robert was called back inside and told of the plan, his face lit up with such pure joy that both women started crying again. He threw himself at his birth mother first, holding her tight and whispering apologies for the things he'd said. Then he turned to Eleanor and hugged her just as fiercely. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for not making me choose. You never have to choose, Robert. Love doesn't work that way. Eleanor stroked his hair, this boy who'd become hers without her planning it, without her even fully realizing it until the threat of losing him made it clear. You have enough heart for both of us. The news of Margaret Hartwell's decision to stay in Silver Peak rippled through the camp with the speed of all good stories. Within days, she'd secured the lease on the old Colfax parlor and begun setting up her seamstress shop. The miners, many of whom had been walking around in clothes held together by hope and prayers, descended on her establishment with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. Margaret had steady work before she'd even finished unpacking her sewing supplies. Eleanor helped where she could, introducing Margaret to the other women in camp, making sure she had meals during those first chaotic days of settling in. It was strange, building a friendship with a woman who might have been her rival, but Eleanor found that she genuinely liked Margaret. The other woman was strong and practical, with a dry sense of humor that emerged once she relaxed. They'd both survived loss and hardship, had both clawed their way back from desperation, and that created a bond stronger than competition. You know, Margaret said one afternoon as they sat together mending while the children played outside, when I first saw you, I hated you. You had everything I'd been working toward, my son's love, a home, a family, security. I thought you'd stolen it all from me, and now? Eleanor asked, her needle moving steadily through the shirt she was repairing. Now I think you saved it all for me. If you hadn't taken Robert in, hadn't loved him and cared for him, he might have been lost to the system. Sent to an orphanage or worse. You kept him safe and whole until I could get back to him. Margaret's voice grew thick. You gave me the greatest gift possible. You loved my son when I couldn't be there to do it myself. Eleanor had to set down her sewing because her hands were shaking too hard to continue. He made it easy to love him. They all do, yes, they do. Margaret looked out the window at the children, Robert playing with James, Violet chasing butterflies with Meg supervising, Sarah holding baby Thomas while Luke and Henry showed off their woodcarving skills. You've built something remarkable here, Eleanor. A real family from broken pieces. That takes a special kind of magic, not magic. Just stubbornness and a Dutch oven. But Eleanor smiled, allowing herself to feel proud of what she'd accomplished. 6 months ago she'd arrived in Silver Peak with nothing but desperation and a cast-iron pot. Now she had a family, a home, a community, and something she'd never expected to find, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Summer arrived in full glory, transforming the harsh mountains into something approaching beautiful. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and Eleanor's garden exploded with vegetables that seemed to grow overnight in the intense mountain sun. The new stable was completed, bigger and better than the old one, with a name carved over the door, Violet's Sanctuary. Jackson had spent hours on that carving, getting every letter perfect, and when Violet saw it she'd cried with happiness and declared it the best present anyone had ever given her, on a warm July evening. With the sun painting the mountains gold and the children occupied with some elaborate game involving sticks and imagination, Jackson found Eleanor sitting on the porch steps shelling peas. He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and took over half the basket without comment. I've been thinking, he said after a companionable silence. Always dangerous, Eleanor teased, I want to adopt them. All of them, Robert and Luke and the others whose parents are still alive but unable to care for them, not just Violet and the true orphans. I want to make this official, permanent, unbreakable. He set down the peas and turned to face her fully. I want us to be their real parents. Legally and forever. What do you think? Eleanor felt her throat close with emotion. I think that's the best idea you've ever had. But what about their birth parents? Margaret and the others, won't they object? I've already spoken to Margaret. She's in favor of it, said she'd rather Robert have 2 sets of parents who love him than be caught in legal limbo. And the other parents, the ones in Denver or back east, they've already essentially abandoned their children. Judge Morrison thinks the adoptions will go through without much trouble. Jackson took her hand, laced their fingers together. We'd be a real family then. Not just circumstance or convenience or legal fostering. A real family, we're already a real family, Eleanor said, but her heart was soaring. But yes, let's make it official. Let's adopt every single one of them and make sure they never have to worry about being taken away again. The adoption proceedings took 3 months to complete, requiring mountains of paperwork, multiple interviews with territorial authorities, and testimony from what seemed like everyone in Silver Peak. But in October, with autumn painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Judge Morrison signed the final papers that made Robert Garrett, Luke Garrett, Margaret Garrett, Henry Garrett, James Garrett, Sarah Garrett, Thomas Garrett, and Violet Garrett the legal children of Jackson and Eleanor Garrett. The celebration that followed was the largest Silver Peak had ever seen. Miners and their families came from 3 different camps. Margaret brought a cake she'd somehow managed to bake despite having never done so before, and even the new mine owners sent a generous gift of money to help support the growing family. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army, all of it presided over by Eleanor's grandmother's Dutch oven, which had been given place of honor on a special table decorated with wildflowers. Speech, someone called out, and the crowd took up the chant. Speech. Speech, Eleanor tried to demur, but Jackson pulled her to her feet and up onto a bench so everyone could see her. She looked out at the sea of faces, rough miners and their families, Margaret standing with tears in her eyes, her 8 children arrayed around her like a living testament to the power of love over circumstance. For a moment she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by how far she'd come from that terrible day in Philadelphia. "I came to Silver Peak with nothing," she said finally, her voice carrying across the crowd. "I'd lost everything, my home, my reputation, my hope for the future. I answered a 12-word advertisement out of pure desperation, expecting nothing more than a roof over my head and maybe enough to eat. What I found instead was redemption." She paused, looking down at Jackson's upturned face. "Saw the love shining there. I found a man who was brave enough to let himself heal, to open his heart again after devastating loss. I found children who taught me that family isn't about biology or perfection, it's about showing up every day with love and determination and refusing to give up even when everything seems impossible. I found a community that values character over reputation, that judges people by their actions rather than their pasts." Her voice grew stronger. "6 months ago, I was Eleanor Blackwood, a disgraced widow with no future. Today I'm Eleanor Garrett, mother of 8, wife to the best man I've ever known, and a member of this extraordinary community. If my story teaches anything, it's that our worst moments don't define us. What defines us is what we choose to build from the rubble of our losses. Thank you all for helping me build something beautiful." The cheers that followed were thunderous, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was looking at her children, all 8 of them, legally and forever hers, and feeling a contentment so profound it was almost painful. Violet was clapping with delight, Sarah was wiping away tears, Robert was grinning with pride, and the others were all showing variations of joy and belonging. This was what she'd been searching for all her life without knowing it. Not perfection, not ease, not even happiness in the conventional sense. But purpose. Meaning. A place where she was essential rather than merely tolerated, where her worth was measured in love given and received rather than in social standing or material possessions. As the party continued around them, Jackson pulled Eleanor aside to a quiet corner of the yard. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that took her breath away. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box wrapped in cloth. "I've been working on this for months, wanted to wait for the right moment." Eleanor unwrapped the box with trembling hands and found inside a ring, not a simple band but something elaborate and beautiful. Carved from Colorado silver with tiny wildflowers etched into the metal. It was the most beautiful piece of jewelry she'd ever seen. The first ring was just a plain band, bought in haste to make our marriage legal, Jackson said, taking the ring from the box. "This one is different. Every flower represents one of our children, 8 flowers for 8 reasons my heart beats. I wanted you to have something that symbolizes what we've built together, Eleanor. Something that shows you're not just my wife but my partner in every sense of the word." He slid the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band, and it fit perfectly, the silver warm against her skin. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." Eleanor whispered. "Jackson, I know." He pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too. More than I ever thought possible. You walked into my life when I was barely alive, and you brought me back to the world. You and those children, you're everything, Eleanor. Everything that matters." They stood that way for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while their children played in the background and the mountains stood witness to their love. Around them, Silver Peak continued its evening routines, miners heading home to supper, families gathering around fires, the sounds of life lived simply but well. This was happiness, Eleanor thought. Not the absence of problems or pain, but the presence of love strong enough to survive anything. She'd been tested by fire, literally and figuratively, and she'd emerged stronger, more certain of who she was and what she was capable of achieving. The disgraced widow from Philadelphia was gone, burned away in that stable fire along with the last of Eleanor's shame and self-doubt. In her place stood Eleanor Garrett, mother and wife and survivor, a woman who'd proven that the worst day of your life doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something better. As the stars began to appear overhead and their children's laughter echoed through the mountain air, Eleanor sent a silent thank you to her grandmother. whose Dutch oven had carried her through the darkest times and helped her build a home from nothing. She'd arrived in Silver Peak with that pot and a prayer. She'd leave it someday, many, many years from now, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having lived a life full of meaning and love and purpose, but that was a story for another time. Tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for holding close the people who mattered most and recognizing just how far they'd all come together. Eleanor Garrett had found her redemption in the mountains of Colorado, and it was sweeter than any bread she'd ever baked.